Well, good morning, everyone. Kalimera. Let me begin by expressing my sincere gratitude for the opportunity to once again be here sharing my work, my ongoing reflections, and a special thanks to Neni, which I'll try to now pronounce it correctly as Idiatheras Evcharistes Ti Neni. Well, that was as far as my Greek could pronounce it, but it's a special thank you, Neni, for organizing this amazing conference. I also want to apologize because English is not my first language, so I have a text. I will kind of sometimes read from the text, but I will try to be as interactive and fluent as possible. Thank you so much for your attention on this little shortcoming of my language. I was challenged to contribute to this discussion by offering a perspective or a critical insight from the field of political economy and how it relates to science. For those who are unfamiliar with the field, political economy offers a historical, grounded, and structural informed analysis of the relationships between science, the state, and the production of value in motion. It is a framework that seeks to understand how knowledge production is shaped by the material conditions, the institutional arrangements, and the asymmetries of power. Therefore, before addressing these central questions, I would like to introduce four key concepts, or rather key assumptions that inform my analytical framework. And you will see they are very similar to the speakers that came before me. So the first concept is the concept of symmetry. Symmetry in the social studies of science and technology means that both true and false scientific beliefs should be explained using the same types of causes, typically social, cultural, and historical facts. It is an approach that rejects the idea that true beliefs arise from reason and evidence, while false ones result from error or bias, but it analyzes knowledge claims without assuming in advance their truth or their falsity. The second concept is the concept of co-production, which refers to the idea that science and society shaped one another simultaneously. Scientific knowledge and social order are not separate. Rather, they are produced together through shared processes. As we create scientific facts, we also shape social norms, institutions, identities, and power relationships, and vice versa. Notably developed by the STS scholar Sheila Yazanov, this concept highlights how science and technology are deeply embedded in political, cultural, and institutional contexts. The third concept is dialectical materialism, and I borrow this from philosophy. It is a philosophical framework that seeks to understand and explains the dynamics of the material world, including nature, society, and knowledge, through the lens of contradiction, change, and historical development. And to some extent, it is more a method than a concept, a method to analyze and emphasize the process, the movement, and the change that, unlike mechanical and linear reasoning, sees reality as composed of interrelated and contradictory forces that are constantly in motion and transformation. Today, I will also try to speak and address a little bit the issues of contradictions within the scientific realm. The last concept is the concept of subsumption. It is a concept originated in the critique of political economy, where it describes how labor processes and social relations are brought under the control of capital. It refers how capital integrates and restructures labor to serve the goals of extracting surplus value and capital accumulation. In political economy, we distinguish two forms of subsumption, the formal and the real. In the formal subsumption, capital takes over an existing labor process without fundamentally changing how the work is done. The production process, in this sense, remains largely intact, but becomes subordinated to the capitalist imperatives. So labor is commodified and workers, and in this case, researchers, are turned into wage earners. This is evident, and for example, in the early industrial research laboratories of the late 19th century, where scientists were employed by capitalist firms, but continued to work according to the epistemic norms of academic science. Similarly, in the post-Second World War era, the university science, heavily funded by states for strategic purposes, was formally subsumed. Although scientists became salaried professionals serving national economic and military purposes, their autonomy over research agendas and methodologies remained relatively intact. In contrast, real subsumption marks a qualitative shift in which scientific labor is actively transformed by and for the logic of capital accumulation. This is evident in the neoliberal restructuring of both academia and industrial science, where knowledge production is increasingly governed by profitability, intellectual property regimes, and competitive metrics. For example, in the pharmaceutical research is now organized around the imperatives of venture capital, patentability, with discovery processes fragmented, project managed, and disciplines pushed to deliver marketable outputs. Likewise, in the university sector, scientists are reconstituted as entrepreneurial subjects, compelling to align their work with fundable trends, publication metrics, and commercial partnerships. So here, capital no longer just merely appropriates the results of the scientific labor, it actually reshapes the very organization, the direction, and the meaning of that labor. This is an approach that we use in a broader framework that we call the systems of provision, and where we see, like in housing, like in energy, like in food, that the production and distribution of the scientific knowledge involves specific institutional arrangements, economic structures, and cultural frameworks. So, to start to answer the question that has been posed to me, what is the role of the economy in regulating the relationships between science and political decision-making? I first had to answer to what is the economy? In general terms, economy refers not only how society imagines and organizes the production, the distribution, and the consumption of goods and services, but also how it distributes the wealth generated. It includes everything from individual choices about what to buy to how governments manage public resources or operate in international trade. From a neoclassic economic perspective, the economy is understood as a system of individual choices, of market relations that efficiently allocate scarce resources. It assumes that supply and demand operate in equilibrium, guided by rational actors pursuing utility maximization and profit. According to this view, economy is neutral, a technical system of transactions that exists in relation but separates from society and from politics. In contrast, in the field of political economy, we see it differently. We see economy as deeply embedded in social structures and historical process, not as neutral systems, but rather as the material foundation, the infrastructure of a society. According to our view, the economy determines the superstructure, so the laws, the politics, and therefore the science. Moreover, political economy contends that the economy takes historical specific forms. Today, the dominant model of economics is the capitalist mode. It's an economic system based on private ownership of the means of production, guaranteed by legal and coercive mechanisms, mostly implemented by the state. It is characterized by market-based relations where goods and services are exchanged based on supply and demand, and where labor is commodified. Most people in capitalism and in science today do not own the means of production, neither the productive assets that result from their labor. So they have to sell their labor and entering in a wage relationship that is often asymmetrical in terms of power. Under capitalism, again, economy is driven by the pursuit of profit. Goods and services are produced not primarily to meet the social needs, but to generate short-term returns, and is a dynamic that fosters innovation, but also inequality. Yet, capitalism is not uniform. It's not the same everywhere. There are diverse institutional arrangements across countries and regions, which institutional economists named as the varieties of capitalism. For example, in the US, in the UK, we find the models of capitalist economy that is based on liberal markets economies, economies that relate on market-based coordination, limited state intervention, weak labor regulations, and trust in financial markets, or at least it used to be. While in Germany, in Sweden and Netherlands, we find a different type of capitalism, a capitalism that is characterized by coordinated market economies, where strong institutional coordinates between firms, unions, and the states. There are robust labor laws and well-developed technical education systems and stable banking and financial networks. Other models exist. These are the two ideal models, but we also have different, there are also the different models. There is the model of the Mediterranean capitalism, so Portugal, Spain, Italy, and Greece, where the state still plays an important role in the economy, but labor market is less regulated and the informal sector is very preeminent. Of course, we also have the North model, like the Finland model, where the strong welfare state coexists with market economies, or the so-called state capitalisms, as in China and Russia, where combined market mechanisms act with strong control over strategic sectors. When we place the concept of varieties of capitalism within a world system theory, it reveals that the development of capitalism is globally uneven. Different regions and nations integrate the world economy at different historical moments and under different levels of industrialization, institutional maturity, and social formation. This global unevenness is therefore not a result of underdevelopment or as a failure, but a structural feature of capitalism itself. Capitalists often advances through the subordination and exploitation of other regions, including through forms such as colonialism and imperialism, where the core capital regions benefit from extraction the value from the peripheral ones. Okay, so these contrasts illustrate how national economy institutional contexts produce distinct scientific trajectories and capabilities. While science is often presented as universal, particularly in its normative and epistemic foundation, it is not produced and or applied uniformly across all these contexts. Economic goals shape the organization of the scientific systems because they shape the institutions that compose the scientific systems, leading to different models of scientific production and governments. These differences in turn result in an uneven scientific development. The term uneven refers to the structural disparities between regions and countries, disparities in industrialization, institutional maturity, and scientific capacities. while the idea of the combined highlights how different temporalities and social forms coexist within the same space, creating hybrid systems of scientific production. It is important to have this in mind because we should acknowledge that late developing countries do not simply replicate the development trajectories of early industrialized nations. Instead, these countries often skip stages, grafting advanced technologies onto less social and institutional foundations, and which produces complex and contradictory systems where archaic and modern elements interact, and as a result, the scientific development becomes nonlinear and deeply embedded in historical dynamics of capitalist development. However, this asymmetry does not imply that there is a total absence of science in the peripheral regions. Rather, it points out to the combined forms of knowledge production where global epistemologies coexist, often uneasily, with local needs, contexts, and traditions. This unevenness reinforces the international division of scientific labor and reveals the political economy underpinning global science. A compelling analysis of this dynamic is offered by the Hungarian scholar Martin Demeter in his article, The World Systemic Dynamics of Knowledge Production, the Distribution of Transnational Academic Capital in Social Sciences. Please bear in mind that he uses this example for the social sciences, but he since has developed and has a book where he brings all the other different sciences. So, Merton draw on Pierre Bourdieu's notion of academic capital, which is defined as the resources accumulated through scholarly production, institutional affiliation, and intellectual prestige, argues that academic capital is unevenly distributed along core peripheral lines in the global knowledge economy. While Bourdieu conceptualizes capital in a broad and sometimes intangible form, the idea of the symbolic capitalist, Demeter applies it specifically to the international academic field. He demonstrates that elite institutions in core regions, the Ivy League university in the US, the leading European publishing houses, they dominate the production, the validation, and the circulation of academic knowledge and control editorial boards, define methodologies and theoretical standards, win prestigious grants, and set the criteria of excellence. In contrast, scholars and institutions from peripheral regions face systemic obstacles. They are underrepresented in high-impact journal editorial boards. They must publish in dominant language, usually the English, and often align their research agendas to external funding priorities. Their contributions are frequently evaluated by metrics and standards established in the global north, reinforcing epistemic dependency. Nevertheless, the dynamics of academic capital also reveal internal hierarchies within the periphery. Some countries, such as South Korea, Israel, Singapore, and Hong Kong, exhibit strong integrations into core scientific institutions and infrastructures, with their scientific systems serving as intermediaries, benefiting from privileged ties with the core while maintaining local distinctiveness. So, by framing science as a system of academic capital accumulation, we can better understand the reproduction of inequalities in global knowledge production and the mechanisms through which epistemic hierarchies are maintained. Nonetheless, it is important to highlight, again, that the peripheral actors are not passive recipients of the system. They resist, and innovation occurs in multiple levels through epistemic disobedience, alternative research agendas, decolonial methodologies, and efforts to reclaim science for local and public interests. This complexity of the economy and the economy of science is important to analyze, especially when we're thinking about science policy, because it allows us to answer to a couple of questions. How is policy scientific policy formulated, who influences it, and how it is mediating the relationships between knowledge production, the state, and decision-making. And this leads to another question, which my good friend Eric already approached. I will do a brief different approach from what he said, but I have to say I totally subscribe to everything he just presented to us. So decision-making is a process of identification and of choice. It is a core feature of practical reasoning and deliberation rooted in philosophical traditions dating back from the ancient Greece. In modern contexts, decision-making is deeply connected to the concept of politics, as Eric well explained, understood as the structuring of choices that shape collective life. As Harold Lasswell famously put it, politics is about who gets what, when, and how. However, politics is also understood differently depending on various traditions. Liberal thoughts conceptualize politics as a competition between different interests in a pluralist society, while more critical approaches define politics as an expression of class struggles over the control of the state or of the economy. Yet, politics can also be understood as a structured decision-making involving power and authority to make decisions on behalf of others. And normally this structure is the state. Today, in our democratic societies, the model that most of our states adopt is a model of decision-making that combines participatory methods with knowledge-based inputs. And this is where science enters as the key source of authority, the evidence base, the data-driven policy. Run after the science, follow the science. It is a paradigm of knowledge-based decision-making that has emerged in parallel with economic transformations. From the 70s onwards, advanced capitalist economies have been shifting from industrial to knowledge-based intensive economies. Information technology, biotechnology, fintech, finance, pharmaceuticals, they all are now the strategic goals of our markets as we have progressively outsourced manufacturing and industrial production to the global south. So the global north in the last decades has invested in research, development, innovation, knowledge, data, and intellectual properties became assets. In this context, academical capital is a fundamental instrument in generating economic value and growth. States and corporations alike began promoting the idea that human capital, creativity, innovation are central for the economic competitiveness and development. And this has redefined knowledge as a productive force, elevating science in the political discourse, but also subjugated it to a new form. This shift in economic orientations were also accompanied by the transformation of the rule of the state. Neoliberalism, as both as the ideology and the set of policy frameworks, restructured the state into a more managerial entity. It became an entity that deals with efficiency, ensuring competitiveness works, reforms based on central organizing principles. Buzzwords like evidence-based policy, data-driven governance proliferate. And these concepts suggest that political decision could be rendered more rational, objective, and defensible if grounded in scientific evidence. While such ideals have their merit, they also serve to depoliticize contentious decisions, reduce public debates, and legitimize reforms driven solely by economic private interests. So science is, in this model, positioned as a neutral arbiter, a source of authority that can guide policy, yet, as Eric also demonstrated, neutrality is often an illusion, and scientific knowledge is embedded in institutionals that have been shaped by funding priorities and are influenced by political and economic contexts. The question then is not if science should or not inform decision-making, but how it does, under what conditions, who defines the relevant questions, who funds the research, who interprets the evidence, and whose interests are served by the outcomes. I think Eric actually explained this very well in his presentation. This brings me back to the state. And because I think the state is a fundamental actor when we are trying to actually understand what is science these days and how science relates and interacts with the economy and the political decision-making. The modern relationship between science and the state has deep historical roots, while I could trace them back to ancient civilizations such as in Egypt, in India, and in China. I will refrain to do so. I have been advised not to write another PhD, so I will start by focusing on the relationships between science and modern states. Particularly in the 19th century. During the 19th century, states across Europe institutionalized science as part of their modernization strategies. Science research became a means of supporting industrial development, military expansion, public wealth, public health, and national prestige. Institutions such as national academies, state-funded laboratories, polytechnic schools emerged to align knowledge production to the state priorities. This model intensified in mid-20th century, particularly during and after the world wars. It is a fact that wartime mobilizes science like no one else, especially disciplines such as physics, engineering, and medicine, which have demonstrated a strategic value for the state. In post-war periods, however, many countries kept adopting the strategic position of science and created what is often called the linear model of innovation. So we start from basic research that leads to applied research, which in turn will lead to technological development and economic growth. The logic underlying the establishment of major public research agencies, such as the National Scientific Foundation in the United States and similar bodies across Europe. So the states played a leading role in funding based research, promoting technological development, and coordinating science policy. Universities too, at this time, were expanded and integrated into national innovation systems. However, this post-war settlement began to shift by the late 20th century with a neoliberal turn. You will see the same graphic that Brian just showed you. It is the same, I think a little bit more visible than what he had. But the point is to change, to show how there's a period during the 70s that reshapes, it shifts the priorities of the state regarding public science. The neoliberal turn, which was marked by austerity policies, market deregulation, and privatization, transformed scientific policy and transformed the state. Public funded stagnated or declined in many of the regions, while expectations increased for science to generate economic returns, attracting private investments and addressing market-driven challenges. Science was thus reframed as an instrumental of competitiveness rather than a public good. It was increasingly evaluated based on metrics such as patents, publications, and third-party funding. Private partnerships proliferated, as did industry-sponsored research. University adopt corporate management practices, and new institutional forms, such as the technology transfer offices and the innovation hubs, emerged to commercialize the research outcomes of our labor. These transformations redefine, as I said, also the role of the state. Rather than directly funding and managing research, the state became a broker. He creates incentives, coordinates stakeholders, and ensures that there is an environment that favors innovation. This shift, we name it from government to governance, also alters how science is prioritized, organized, and legitimized. As Philip Mirowski has extensively documented, these transformations, particularly in his work on the neoliberal restructuring of science, argue that neoliberal regimes have been reshaped not only through market mechanisms, but through a distinctive epistemological and institutional logic. Mirowski contends that neoliberalism does not simply privatize science, it reconfigures the nature of knowledge production, introducing competition, intellectual property regimes, audit cultures as essential principles of our organizations. This also leads to changes that he calls the entrepreneurial university, where science inquiry is now subordinated to the commercial imperatives and where knowledge becomes tradable commodity rather than a public good. So understanding these historical shifts is crucial when analyzing the present, and especially when trying to answer such a question, because it reveals that the relationship between science and the state, it's not fixed. It evolves responding to political, economic, and institutional pressures, conflicts, and contradictions. And it shows how science has moved from being in the domain of the public investment to a field increasingly shaped by market logics and competitive discourses. You can see this data from OECD database. These days, most of the expenditure is made and performed by private companies. You can see how they have skyrocketed comparing to government institutions and higher education institutions. This is for the OECD countries. The same happens to the European Union countries and the United States. But as I have been arguing, it is not the same, or it was not the same for Portugal, at least until very recently. So the shift in Portuguese economy, in scientific system, is earlier. So the shift we've seen during the 70s and the 80s taking place in the core countries, in Portugal, it actually started to happen by the 20s, okay? And Germany, as you can see, follows the tendency of the United States, the UK, and the majority of the core countries. You can also see that it has become an instrument on the hands of the economy. It has become oriented. Although non-oriented research is still a reality, if we combine how the orientations for economic development, health and environment, space, and education and social, you will see that this idea that we have free of inquiry to pursue science production based on our own values, internal values and epistemic values is no longer the reality of how science is produced. So the neoliberal restructuring of science has a profound effect on the autonomy, purpose, and public value of research. As funding agencies, universities, and researchers adopt logics of competition, impact, and entrepreneurialism, the nature of the science practice is transformed. First, we've seen that increasingly science becomes evaluated through metrics and perform indicators. Second, we see how funding structures have shifted from core institutional budgets to project-based competitive grants. Third, we see how public-private partnerships and commercializations pressure to blur the boundaries between academic research and industrial interests. And we see how these dynamics poses serious challenges to the public character of science. As I said in the beginning, a very important concept is the concept of subsumption. And to make it clear, real subsumption of science under capital represents this transformation in the nature, organization, and governance of the scientific labor. In this phase, we no longer have a science that is merely appropriated for capital. It is capital. It is actively restructured to serve imperatives of accumulation. It is accumulation. Research priorities, institutional configurations, governance mechanisms, scientific labor itself are realigned to reflect the logics of the market. This transformation is driven by combinations of corporate strategies and proactive state interventions. And again, the state plays a central role in promoting and legitimizing the subsumption by deploying a variety of fiscal and regulatory mechanisms. I highlight here some of the mechanisms that the state implements, such as defunding of public institutions by producing cuts to core institutional fundings, changing to project-based competitive fundings. The incentives to private investments is also a strategy promoted by the states. Co-funding schemes, subsidized tax benefits, encouraging corporate participation in publicly funded research. I have here some examples, such as the European Innovation Council Fund, the Advanced Market Committees, pre-commercial procurements, so on and so forth. There's also R&D, so research and development tax credits. These are fiscal tools that shift the burden of innovation costs to the public while rewarding the private actors. There are a few examples of this, such as in the United States, the Research and Experimentation Tax Credit, and the United Kingdom, the Research and Development Tax Relief Scheme and Patent Box. The state also, as I said, shifts structural funding. So the state used to fund universities and fund science in a structural way, giving the money without a lot to ask, but now it is based on competitive grants, including the base funding. It starts to be based on competitive funds and mission-oriented grants. The state also is a key in promoting public-private partnerships frameworks. In the European Union, supranational. Sometimes they look like supernatural, but they are supranational institutions that still are the states, okay, have created the joint technology initiatives, such as the Innovative Medicine Initiative, they are co-funded by the European Commission. So there's a lot of the initiatives and schemes and modes of governing that are state promoted, only and solely for the purpose of integrating private business into research and ensuring that they keep motivated into investing in knowledge production. And of course, the commodification of science, which is, I think, the most obvious form that we see these days, or at least the most obvious form for most of us. And also these privatizations outputs are the result of conflicts. We know the bailed or legislative acts. But I also wanted to highlight the character of the court's decisions. Unfortunately, I would love to develop more on this, maybe in the next conference. I will dedicate a conference to the relationships of science and law, but it's important to highlight that the courts had a tremendous influence and impact on how this story unfolds. And we should all remember that it was the courts that reinforced the possibility of some forms of commodifications of science, especially in the field of biology. Okay. So these mechanisms underpin the broader process of subsumption, which manifests itself in several ways. The research priorities now are marked by the market potential, marginalizing curiosity-driven or critical inquiry, particularly in humanities and social sciences, but not only, as we've seen yesterday. There is institutional restructures. Universities start to behave like corporations. They start to manage and use models such as corporations. They evaluate their performance based on metrics, KPIs, implement branding strategies. They displace collegial governments and academic autonomy to the purpose of managing as a firm, as a business. We also see the rock rising and the skyrocketing of precarious labor conditions, although it is true that they always existed. In the last 20 years, they have in quantity intensified. Short-term contracts are the only reality most of us will ever will never see in the in the academia. We are pressured for competition, and if we don't bring money to the university, we don't have value, even if we are brilliant researchers doing frontier research. We have to bring the money. If you don't bring the money, you're not doing your job properly. There's also the development of new forms of organizations and technological infrastructures, and a shift in the governance mechanisms, where the rhetoric of the stakeholders' participation and the fake idea of co-creation actually gives spaces for the industrial actors to gain privileged access to the decision-making process. Reports by the Corporate Europe Observatory highlight this really, really well. They demonstrate how public-private partnerships, like the EMEI and the BB, as I referred, are mechanisms promoted to enable corporations to determine which research agendas will be implemented and ensure that these research agendas benefit their own interest and not the public interests. Okay, so in parallel with the commodification, we've seen all these transformations, and of course, this process of commodification and subsumption of science brings a lot of contradictions because, well, there is something within our labor, within science, that makes us resist. And this is where I come to the idea of the contradictions, also as forms of moving and transforming what science means. So this was not a passive thing that happened to us. This was not a shock therapy. We were not victims. We are part of this process, and some of us are part of the resistance to this process. These developments reveal the structural contradiction inherent not just to science, but to the core nature of the capitalist system. And these contradictions are not by chance, they are not incidental, you know, they are actually embedded in the very logic of the capital accumulation. Capital accumulation originates contradictions within the economic process of value production. The first contradiction that I would like to highlight that exists within the science is the epistemic logic of science. Science tends toward collaboration, openness, and cumulative knowledge production. I know some here will question the idea of cumulative knowledge production, but let's, for the purpose of this argument, stay with this idea. This clashes with the economic logic of capital that want competition, secrecy, and property control. Science inquiry thrives in conditions of intellectual freedom, with time for reflection, with collective interrogations of assumptions, with moments like we are having here. But capitalist, and capitalist science in particular, and in contracts, accelerates timelines, fragments research through market competition, and rewards outputs that immediately produce exchange values, not used values. The second contradiction is that the labor conditions of scientists reflect a broader contradiction of capital work. While scientific labor requires autonomy, creativity, and long-term commitment, it is increasingly subject to precarious conditions, standardized performance metrics, and managerial oversights. This tension not only leads to the alienation of the scientists, which becomes more estranged with the content and purposes of their own work, but also drives, which is driven more by funding cycles and institutional prestige, but also creates fraud, hype. We all know the stories of those exploitation of PhDs, postdoctoral researchers. We all see how is it possible to have scientists that published 10, 15, 100 articles per year. This is a contradiction that, well, makes us lose the confidence in science and how actually science is produced. The third contradiction is the contradiction between the science ideologic role and its critical potential. So science is frequently mobilized to legitimize technocratic policy, economic growth, and dominant paradigms of development, yet the same scientific practices generate knowledge that challenge this system by exposing ecological crises, systemic inequalities, and limitations of the market-driven logics. So this makes science both an instrument of reproduction and a potential site for rupture. The fourth is the access. Universities and public research bodies are increasingly tasked with generating patents, attracting private investments, which goes against the way we actually do and conceive research. So together, these contradictions do not simply hinder the function of science, they structure also their internal crises and crisis tendencies. Understanding these contradictions is essential, not merely to critique them, but to construct an alternative that reclaims science as an emancipatory potential. And to finish, I would like to just briefly address the idea of reclaiming science as a public good. Despite the pressures, resistance is possible and is active and is real across Europe and beyond. Academics and civil society movements have contesting the commodity form of science, have contested the subsumption of science under capitalism, and have proposing alternative visions. These include reinvesting in public funds, democratizing governance, advancing open science, and decolonizing knowledge production, such as forging strategic alliances, which I hope we can keep doing. So reclaiming science, and to conclude, reclaiming science for the public good requires not only to reveal the specific mechanisms and relationships and how economy relates to the science, to the state, and to the policy decision, but also to reconfigure the social relations that underpin knowledge production. And so I think we should call for a renewed vision of science as a democratic, inclusive, and a collective governance endeavor that serves human needs, ecological sustainability, and epistemic justice. And hopefully, I don't have answers, but hopefully during this conference, we can advance a little bit more on that strategy. Thank you all. So sorry for some of my gaps in the English. I hope it was clear for everyone. And if there's any doubt, we'll be in the discussion to try to clarify. Thank you so much.